Emergency alert. All listeners, turn off your radios. If you still hear her voice, it's already too late. They call her the girl in the broadcast. The signal isn't coming from this world anymore. The clock blinked 11:59 p.m. In cold, unforgiving red digits above the studio door, its monotonous glow casting shadows over the cluttered desk where I sat, headset snug against my ears. This was my domain. The late-night radio booth where the world's whispers gathered like moths to a flame. Tonight, the air felt heavier. Not the usual electric buzz of anticipation, but something colder. Something waiting beneath the static. I ran my fingers over the microphone, adjusting the volume as the station's signature low hum filled my ears. "Good evening, night owls and restless souls," I began, my voice steady but low. "Welcome to the witching hour, where the paranormal meets the airwaves. I'm your host, Mark Harper, guiding you through the shadows that crawl just out of sight." The first segment was routine. Tales of haunted houses, urban legends, and the occasional prank call that made me smirk. The phone lines lit up steadily with callers eager to share or doubt, their voices a comforting chorus in the solitude of the night. But somewhere around 12:15 a.m., the rhythm shifted. A sudden burst of static erupted through my headphones, harsh, crackling, like a storm trapped in the wires. I leaned forward, fingers tightening on the console, as a faint, trembling voice slipped through the noise, soft yet urgent. "Please, stop the flood," it whispered. My heart stuttered. That wasn't a prank. It was a child's voice, fragile and pleading, cutting through the usual interference with chilling clarity. The line went dead immediately after, leaving only a thin thread of static humming in the void. "Hello? Are you there?" I called, toggling the controls, but the connection was gone. I frowned, rubbing my temple. The station often picked up odd signals, lost transmissions from distant places. But this felt different, personal. I tried to shake off the unease as a trick of the night, a clever trickster's stunt. Maybe a kid with a toy microphone or some clever sound effects. Yet, as the minutes passed, the studio's lights flickered, the monitors jittered, and a cold draft brushed against the back of my neck despite the sealed room. I stood, stretching, eyes scanning the dim space. "Probably just a coincidence," I muttered, though my voice betrayed a thread of doubt. The phone lines remained eerily silent for a while, the usual chatter replaced by a thick, oppressive quiet. I returned to my chair, heart still pounding, and resumed the broadcast. But the child's words echoed in my mind. "Please, stop the flood." What flood? And why now? The night dragged on, each minute heavier than the last, the studio's hum now punctuated by occasional flickers and distant, unidentifiable noises. I leaned back, staring at the clock, wondering what the rest of the night would bring. Outside the studio, the city lay asleep, unaware of the tremors rippling through the airwaves. Inside, something had stirred. A lost signal, a prophetic voice, or perhaps a warning from somewhere beyond. Whatever it was, it had chosen tonight to speak. And I was listening. A sudden sharp pop from the speakers jolted me upright. The static surged again, louder, drowning out my voice. Then, just as abruptly, silence. The line was dead. I stared at the receiver, fingers trembling. The flood was coming. I could feel it. The night was just beginning. The studio was quieter than usual when I settled behind the microphone that night. the hum of the city outside, a distant murmur beneath the low buzz of the equipment. I adjusted the levels, the familiar rhythm of the late-night paranormal show settling over me like a well-worn coat. My voice, rough from the hours of talking and caffeinated exhaustion, felt steady as I introduced the show. But beneath it all, a flicker of unease had begun to kindle since the previous night's strange call. I hadn't forgotten the child's voice, the soft, trembling plea that had cut through the static so unexpectedly. "Please, stop the flood." At first, I'd chalked it up to a prank, a trick of the wires or some clever kid testing the boundaries of a late-night show. But the voice had lingered in my mind, haunting the edges of my thoughts as I waited for more calls. And calls came. Not just the usual spectrum of midnight oddities and urban legends, but something else entirely. More voices, strangers from across the city, repeating the same phrase, the same desperate plea. "Please, stop the flood," they said. Each call carried a thread of panic beneath the words, a tremor that made my skin crawl. One night, a woman from a suburb called in, her voice trembling as she described water creeping beneath her basement door, cold and relentless. "It started yesterday," she said, her breath catching. "The water just came up, and then I heard the voices on the line, the same words your little caller said. It's like they're everywhere." I tried to keep my tone calm, the professional radio host who knew how to soothe nervous callers. But inside, my heart was pounding. Something was wrong. The phrase wasn't just a coincidence, it was a message, a warning, or maybe a cry for help. Over the next few nights, the reports multiplied, callers from different neighborhoods telling eerily similar stories. Water rising inexplicably in homes, streets flooding without warning, voices whispering the same plea, as if carried by the very airwaves we broadcast on. I started to notice strange glitches in the signal, lost packets of data, bursts of static that seemed to carry faint echoes of those ghostly voices. I pulled out the signal maps, tracing the paths of the calls, and what I found unsettled me further. The lost signals weren't random. They clustered around certain frequencies and locations, as if something was trying to break through, to connect. As the show progressed, the line between reality and the supernatural began to blur. Listeners would call in, their voices overlapping in a chorus of warnings that filled the studio with an almost tangible tension. The repeated phrase became a mantra, a siren song that seemed to ripple through the airwaves and into the very walls around me. I found myself obsessing over the pattern, the meaning behind it. Was it a premonition? A warning from something beyond our understanding? Or was it a collective hysteria? A mass projection fueled by fear and static interference? One particularly vivid moment came when a group of callers, seemingly unconnected, all recited the phrase in unison during a live call-in segment. The effect was chilling. Voices overlapping, rising and falling like waves crashing against each other. A flood of sound that filled the room and left me breathless. Yet, amid the growing frenzy, there was a strange unity, a shared experience that bound us all together in the face of an unknown threat. The flood was not just water. It was a tide of voices, of lost signals and prophetic warnings that nobody could explain. I ended that night's broadcast with a heavy heart and a mind swirling with questions. The child's plea was no longer a solitary whisper in the static. It was a chorus, a rising tide that threatened to engulf everything I thought I understood about the world. And as I switched off the microphone, The studio seemed colder, the shadows longer, as if the flood was already here, creeping in with the silence. The question that kept me awake, what exactly were we listening to? And how long before the flood became more than just an echo on the line? The answers, I feared, were still out there, waiting in the lost signals. The night started like any other. The familiar low hum of the radio station's equipment, the soft buzzing of the neon lights above, and the gentle crackle of static that always seemed to linger just beneath the surface of the late-night broadcast. I settled into my chair, the worn leather cold against my skin, and adjusted the microphone. It was barely past midnight, and the city outside was cloaked in silence, save for the occasional distant siren or the whispering wind pressing against the studio windows. The air was heavy tonight, thick with something I couldn't name. Maybe it was the humidity, an unseasonal dampness that had crept in over the last few days. But as I spoke into the microphone, welcoming listeners to another night of tales and voices from beyond, an odd sensation tickled at the back of my neck. Like something unseen was watching, waiting. I was mid-introduction when I noticed it, a faint, nearly imperceptible sound at my feet. At first, I thought it was the creak of the old studio floorboards settling under the weight of the night. But then the softest whisper of moisture, a quiet, almost shy trickle, slithered beneath the edge of the studio door. I glanced down, blinking against the dim light. Sure enough, there it was, a thin, glistening line of water creeping along the threshold. I frowned, rising to my feet to investigate, but the moment I stepped toward the door, the water seemed to retreat, vanishing as mysteriously as it had appeared. Maybe a leak in the building. Old pipes. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease knotting in my stomach. Returning to the microphone, I forced a smile, the familiar click of the call line opening drawing my attention. The first caller's voice was familiar, calm but tinged with an edge of nervousness. They spoke of strange weather patterns, heavy rains that seemed to come without warning. Another followed, their voice trembling as they described water rising in their basement, creeping up the walls like fingers reaching for air. I took notes, the host in me alert and curious, but a part of me kept glancing down at the floor, half expecting the water to return. And it did. Slowly, steadily, the trickle became a thin pool spreading beneath the door, reflecting the harsh studio lights with a sinister gleam. The phone lines lit up with more callers, their voices overlapping in a growing cacophony of fear and confusion. "Please," one woman cried through the crackling static. "The water's rising. It's everywhere. It's in the streets, in the homes, in the rivers. We don't know what to do." I tried to keep the conversation steady, directing callers to share their experiences, to stay calm. But their stories painted a nightmarish picture. Neighbors caught in floods that appeared without cause, entire blocks submerged in murky water, and an undercurrent of something darker, a shared sense of impending doom. The studio's temperature seemed to drop, the dampness settling into the walls and seeping into my clothes. I noticed my breath fogging in the air as the humidity rose sharply. The microphone picked up every slight noise, the distant drip of water, the subtle creak of the building's old bones. And beneath it all, the steady, almost rhythmic lapping of water against some unseen edge. I looked down again. The water had reached my ankles now, cold and insistent. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the desk to steady myself. Rational thoughts battled with the rising panic inside me. This was impossible, or should have been. How could water invade a studio on the 8th floor? How could callers across the city be experiencing the same flood, the same fear? My voice wavered slightly as I addressed the listeners. Stay calm, everyone. Help is on the way. We're monitoring the situation closely. But the words felt hollow, even to my own ears. Then, the calls began to change. No longer simple reports, but desperate pleas, warnings whispered into the static. Please, stop the flood. A chorus of voices echoed, some faint, some urgent. The phrase was chilling in its repetition, as if the callers were all connected, caught in some terrible shared nightmare. I leaned into the microphone, trying to maintain control. But the flood was no longer just outside. It was inside, pressing against me. A living thing. The studio lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to sway like waves in an unseen current. My fingers trembled as I switched between callers, their voices merging into a rising tide of sound that threatened to drown me. Suddenly, the power dipped, the monitors flickering erratically. The water sloshed around my feet, cold and real, and a sudden sharp knock came from the studio door. I froze, heart pounding, breath shallow. Was someone out there? Or was it the flood itself, reaching for me? I swallowed the rising dread and forced myself to speak. This is your host, still on the air. We're going through an unusual situation here, but I promise we'll get through it together. The low hum of the late-night broadcast was suddenly punctuated by a sharp crackle of static. A familiar but increasingly unsettling sound that had become the hallmark of these restless nights. I sat behind the microphone, the faint glow of the control panel illuminating my face in an otherwise dim room. Outside, the rain drummed steadily against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to merge with the growing unease inside the studio. Tonight, I knew, was different. The voices were growing bolder, their messages more insistent, and the creeping water beneath my feet was no longer a distant threat but a palpable presence. I began the evening as usual, greeting my listeners with a practiced calm. "Good evening, listeners," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "You're tuned into the witching hour, where the veil between worlds is thinnest, and the voices of the forgotten echo through the static. Tonight, we listen closely." The irony of my words was not lost on me. I was about to listen too closely and pay the price. As the calls came in, a chorus of whispers and fragmented phrases filled the airwaves. "Please stop the flood," they repeated, a haunting refrain that had become a refrain on these nights. But tonight there was something else, something lurking beneath the surface of those words. I reached out beyond the microphone, grasping for meaning, for a thread to unravel the mystery. Determined to understand, I turned to the past. The local library was my refuge, a dimly lit haven where the scent of old paper and dust clung to the air. The archivist, a stoic woman named Mrs. Halloway, guided me through brittle newspapers and faded photographs. Decades ago, she explained, this town was ravaged by a flood unlike any other. Homes were lost. Lives were drowned beneath the rising tide. Many say the spirits of those lost still call out through the static, trying to warn us. The words chilled me, their weight settling heavily on my chest. As I pieced together the fragments of history, the connection between the voices and the flood became undeniable. These were not random calls. They were echoes of a tragedy, trapped in time, reaching out for release. Back in the studio, the atmosphere shifted. The equipment, once reliable and steady, now betrayed me. The lights flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. The soundboard hissed and groaned, spitting out distorted fragments of the voices I had come to dread. Each technical failure tightened the invisible noose of claustrophobia around me, the walls seeming to close in as the water crept higher. I found myself caught between two worlds, the tangible and the spectral. The studio, my sanctuary, now felt like a tomb slowly filling with water and sound. The voices beneath the waves grew louder, their warnings more urgent, as if the flood itself was a living entity demanding recognition. In the quiet moments between calls, I caught my reflection in the rain-streaked window. The glass blurred the boundary between inside and out, reality and nightmare. Thunder rumbled distantly, a reminder of nature's power beyond the fragile bubble of my broadcast. I was alone, surrounded by voices that were both everywhere and nowhere, trapped beneath the waves of sound and water. As the night deepened, I realized this was no longer just a story to tell. It was a story unfolding around me, pulling me into its depths. And somewhere in the chorus of voices, in the static and the flood, lay a secret I had to uncover, before the water claimed the studio and me entirely. But the question remained: what did the voices truly want? And what would happen when the flood finally broke through? The storm outside intensified, its fury mirrored by the growing tempest within the studio. I braced myself for the answers, or the silence that might follow. Tonight, the voices beneath the waves would speak their truth, whether I was ready to hear it or not. The sound of water was subtle at first, a soft, almost imperceptible splash beneath my feet as I sat behind the microphone. I glanced down, startled, and saw the faint glimmer of liquid pooling around the base of my chair. The studio, my refuge for years, was no longer dry. It was seeping in, inexorable and cold, rising with every tick of the clock. I forced my eyes back to the console, hands trembling slightly as callers flooded the line. Their voices came in waves, overlapping, merging. A chorus of desperate whispers and frantic cries. "Please, stop the flood," they repeated, the phrase now a mantra that pulsed through the speakers with growing intensity. It was no longer just a message. It was a torrent. Trying to maintain control became my sole mission. The microphone felt slick under my fingers. The studio lights flickered as if struggling against the encroaching dampness. And every breath I took tasted faintly of salt and decay. The once crisp air was thick with tension, heavy like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat amplified in my ears alongside the relentless flood of voices. They came from every angle, fearful, pleading, accusing, and I could no longer tell where one ended and another began. It was as if the callers were no longer individuals, but a single entity, a rising tide of sound that threatened to drown me. I leaned forward, voice strained as I tried to speak over the chaos. We need to stay calm, I urged, though my words faltered and cracked like brittle glass. The water swirled around my ankles, cold and unforgiving, and I could feel my resolve slipping like sand through my fingers. Suddenly, a shift in the air. A flash. A face beneath the ripples, pale and haunting, eyes wide and unblinking. The drowned child from the first call, or my mind's cruel invention. It whispered, a voice both fragile and demanding. Please, stop the flood. The hallucination shattered my concentration. I blinked, shaking my head, trying to dispel the vision as the caller's voices surged once more, drowning out my protests and blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Was I losing my mind, or was this real? The flood was no longer just water. It was sound, memory, hysteria, an unstoppable force rising within and without. I reached for the control panel, slick and unstable beneath my fingers. The water crept higher, now threatening the equipment that kept this broadcast alive, and with it my tenuous grasp on sanity. The caller's chorus crescendoed, a symphony of fear and desperation that echoed in every corner of the studio and in the darkest reaches of my mind. I was drowning. In sound, in water, in the flood that refused to end. And through it all, the child's voice remained, a haunting refrain that promised no respite. Please stop the flood. And so I sat, ankle deep in rising water and rising panic, caught between the flood outside and the flood within, waiting for whatever came next. I didn't expect to see the water reach my waist tonight. When I first heard the child's voice through the static, I thought it was just some prank, an elaborate joke to unsettle a late-night host. But now, as I stand in this studio, the flood is no longer a metaphor. It's a rising, tangible threat gnawing at the edges of everything I thought I knew. The first thing I did was call in an expert, Dr. Evelyn Markham, a professor specializing in paranormal phenomena and electromagnetic anomalies. I needed someone who could make sense of this madness, someone who wouldn't dismiss the flood of calls from listeners reporting water creeping into their homes and strange voices whispering from their radios. The studio phone buzzed persistently as I adjusted the microphone, the floodwater swirling around my boots. The faint hum of malfunctioning equipment filled the room, lights flickering in rhythm with the static that had become our unwelcome companion. I cleared my throat and addressed the airwaves. "Good evening, listeners," I said, voice steady despite the chill creeping down my spine. "Tonight we have a special guest, Dr. Evelyn Markham, here to help us understand the strange phenomena we've been experiencing. Dr. Markham, thank you for joining me." A calm voice responded through the headset. "Thank you for inviting me. These reports are unlike anything I've seen before. The lost signals, the flood. It's as if we're witnessing an intersection of realities." I swallowed hard, the water sloshing as I shifted my weight. "Can you explain what you mean?" "The theory," she began, "is that these lost signals we're hearing, the static, the cryptic messages, the repetitive pleas, are not mere interference but breaches. Portals, if you will, between our world and another." The studio's air grew heavy with her words, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the water's disturbed surface. I glanced down. The flood had crept higher, now cold against my skin, swallowing the lower half of my body. "Portals, as in, the voices we're hearing are coming from somewhere else?" I asked, dread curling in my gut. "Precisely. And the flood might be a manifestation of that breach. an omen, or consequence of these worlds bleeding into each other. The phone lines exploded then, a cacophony of voices piling over one another. Listeners reported water rising in their own homes, strange visions of drowned landscapes, and a communal hysteria gripping entire neighborhoods. My hand trembled as I tried to bring order to the chaos. I tapped the mute button, letting the flood of sound wash over the studio for a moment before regaining control. "Please, callers, one at a time," I urged. "We need to understand what's happening." "Dr. Markham, could this mass hysteria be connected to the flood and the signals?" "Yes," she replied, voice grave. "When realities collide, human consciousness can fracture, leading to collective experiences that amplify fear and confusion." I swallowed again, water licking at my waist, cold enough to numb but not enough to stop the pounding in my chest. The studio equipment sparked, the air thick with electricity and something else, something unnameable. "We need to stay calm," I said aloud, more to myself than the audience. "We need to find a way to break the signal, to close whatever this portal is before it's too late." Dr. Markham nodded, though I couldn't see her face clearly through the haze of my own spiraling thoughts. "It's possible, but it requires a sacrifice of energy, a severing of the connection, which might come at a cost." The flood surged, water slapping against the console, creeping towards the wires and circuits like a living thing. For a moment, I saw something in the ripples. A flicker of shadow, a face, a memory. I blinked and it was gone. "Listeners," I said, trying to steady my voice, "we are standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. But we will face it together." The broadcast continued, the flood rising, the voices growing louder, and the night stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere in the static, I heard the child's plea again, soft and desperate. "Please stop the flood." But how? And at what cost? The water closed in around me, and the signal crackled, breaking apart. A fracture in the airwaves and in my mind. The night was far from over. The fluorescent lights above the studio flickered uncertainly, casting long, wavering shadows across the water pooling unevenly on the floor. The hum of the equipment was distorted, a low, throbbing drone that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a rising tide. I sat there, my legs submerged to my knees, the chill of the water seeping through my jeans, cold and unyielding. The microphone before me trembled slightly as I gripped it, my knuckles white with tension. The voice of Emily echoed softly through the speakers. "Please, stop the flood." It was an innocent plea, but it reverberated inside me like a hammer striking glass, fragile and shattering. For nights I had ignored the significance of that child's voice, dismissing it as a prank or a trick of the static. But now, with the water rising and the callers growing more frantic, each repeating Emily's words in a chorus of fear, I could no longer deny the weight of what was happening. The flood was no longer just an external phenomenon. It was inside me, inside this room, inside every crack and crevice of my mind. I leaned back in my chair, the cold seeping into my bones, and my eyes fell on the worn photograph pinned to the bulletin board beside the console. It was a picture of my sister, Anna. her smile radiant in the sunlit summer of years ago. She had been taken from me by a sudden flood, something sudden, merciless, and unrelenting. The water had claimed her as it was now claiming this studio. I swallowed hard, the ache twisting deep in my chest. The flood outside mirrored the one inside me. The loss I had buried deep beneath layers of cynicism and late-night broadcasts. The phone rang again, the shrill tone slicing through the murmur of static and water's soft lapping. I hesitated before pressing the button to answer. The voice on the other end was frantic, trembling with panic. "It's everywhere," they whispered. "The streets, the homes. The water's rising and no one knows where it will stop. We're all drowning and the voices, they won't let us forget." The desperation in their tone was palpable, as if the flood was not just water, but a tide of fear sweeping through the city. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady the microphone. "You're not alone," I said, my voice rough but steady. "We're in this together. Tell me what you're seeing." The caller described a surreal scene of neighbors trapped in their homes. The water creeping up walls, seeping beneath doors, merging into a vast, unstoppable sea. The stories were uncannily similar. Tales of lost signals, whispered warnings, and the child's plea echoing like a prayer over the airwaves. It was as if the flood was both physical and metaphysical, a manifestation of a collective trauma, a warning etched in water and static. Between calls, I found myself staring at the photograph again, the flood lapping at its edges on the desk. Memories crashed through me like waves. Anna's laughter, her hand slipping from mine as the water surged. The helplessness, the grief I had tried to forget. The flood wasn't just a phenomenon outside the studio. It was a tide of sorrow that had shaped me, that had seeped into every broadcast, into every word I spoke. The equipment groaned under the weight of the rising water, cables floating like tangled seaweed. The glow of the console flickered, the lights dimming in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat slowing to a stop. I glanced around the studio, now partially submerged, the walls slick with moisture, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and ozone. The callers' voices overlapped in a cacophony of fear and pleading, a tidal wave of sound that threatened to drown me. I faced a choice: abandon the broadcast, flee the studio and the flood, or stay and continue to be the voice in the darkness, the anchor for those lost in the rising tide. The decision weighed heavily, the flood within mirroring the flood without. But as I listened to the chorus of callers, their desperation entwined with hope, I knew I had to stay. This was more than a show. It was a lifeline. With renewed resolve, I straightened in my chair, the water swirling around me. "We hear you," I said into the microphone. "We'll face this together. We won't let the flood take us without a fight." The line went silent for a moment. Then Emily's voice whispered through the static once more, softer than before. Thank you. Outside, the water continued to rise. But inside the studio, a fragile hope took root amidst the flood within. The cold seeped deeper into my bones as I leaned closer to the microphone. The sound of my own breathing mingling with the distant hum of the failing equipment. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in like the tide swallowing everything in its path. But I was here, anchored by grief and determination alike. The flood was not just an external threat. It was a reckoning I was ready to face no matter the cost. And as the callers' voices rose in a desperate chorus around me, I realized the flood was not just water. It was memory, loss, and the fragile thread of human hope stretched taut across the storm. I was the host, the conduit, the voice in the dark, and I would not let the flood silence me. But the question lingered in the damp air, heavier than the water pressing against the studio walls. How long could we hold back the tide? The night was far from over, and the flood was only beginning to reveal its true depths. The hum of the monitors was a low, sinister drone beneath the steady patter of water creeping over the cold linoleum floor. I sat slumped in my chair, the leather soaked through, water swirling around my calves, chilling me to the bone. The flood, once a distant, whispered threat on callers' lines, was now an undeniable, physical presence in the studio. My voice cracked as I tried to maintain the broadcast, fingers trembling over the console, heart pounding like a drumbeat signaling some ancient war. "Please stop the flood." The phrase echoed again and again through the static, spoken in that soft, haunting voice, the child's voice. It was no longer just a message. It was a command, a prayer, a lament. Over the past nights, those words had multiplied, carried by callers who seemed caught in a fevered trance, each repeating the plea with growing urgency. Tonight, it felt like the flood itself was demanding something from me. The studio lights flickered, casting long shadows on the water's restless surface. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted blood. I clutched my notebook, pages soaked and curling, scrawled with hastily jotted notes and scribbled legends about floods that had swallowed towns whole. Stories of sacrifice to appease wrathful waters. The child's message was not a mere warning. It was a key, one I had to decipher before the flood claimed us all. Callers' voices overlapped into a terrifying chorus, a rising tide of sound that filled the airwaves with panic and despair. "It's coming," one whispered, breath ragged. "The water wants more," another cried. I struggled to keep my own voice steady, to give them something to hold on to amid the chaos. But inside, I was unraveling. Was this flood a punishment, a cleansing, or something darker, a reckoning that demanded a price? Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time blurred, distorted by the relentless surge of water and sound. I learned to listen not just to the voices, but to the silence between them, where meaning lingered like a secret waiting to be uncovered. The child's plea was more than a warning. It was a call for redemption, a sacrifice that might stem the tide. My fingers shook as I adjusted the microphone, the water rising steadily, lapping at the edges of the desk, threatening to drown the equipment that kept me tethered to the outside world. The flood was no longer a distant threat. It was here, inside these walls, demanding a reckoning. I had to decide whether to stay and face whatever this meant, or escape while I still could. But the voices would not let me go. They pressed in, a tide of sound and sorrow, weaving a tapestry of loss and hope. "Please stop the flood," they pleaded, over and over, until the words became a chant, a dirge, a desperate hymn against the rising waters. And beneath it all, I felt the weight of something old and terrible, a truth hidden beneath the waves, waiting to be revealed as the last broadcast played out into the night. The water surged higher, and I took a breath, ready to speak the truth, even if it meant the end. The air in the studio was thick, heavy with moisture and silence. Light flickered erratically from the overhead fixtures, their glow distorted by the rippling water that now lapped at my knees. The microphone before me, once a conduit for voices from around the city and beyond, sputtered and crackled, its signal wavering as if struggling against some unseen force. I sat there, drenched and trembling, the chill of the flood seeping into my bones, the weight of the silence pressing down harder than the water itself. For nights, the voices had come, soft, urgent, fragmented, whispering warnings I barely understood, begging me to please stop the flood. At first, I had dismissed it as a prank, a trick of the static. But as the water rose, so too did the intensity of those calls. The studio was no longer just a place of broadcast, but a battleground, where the past and present collided in a flood of sound and sorrow. Outside the station, the town was eerily quiet. The rain that had begun as a drizzle turned into a relentless downpour, the streets flooding, homes abandoned in haste. I could hear distant sirens wailing, their mournful cries swallowed by the storm. The community, once vibrant and bustling, now seemed suspended in a liminal space between fear and disbelief. I imagined them gathered at the water's edge, staring up at the darkened building, the flicker of emergency lights casting ghostly reflections on the surface of the floodwaters. My hands, cold and slick, reached for the small recorder beside the console. Pressing play, I listened to the last voicemail left by Mara, the child whose voice had haunted my nights from the beginning. Her whisper was fragile, like a breath caught in the wind. Yet it carried a weight that settled deep within me. "Please stop the flood," she said once more, then added, "It's not just the water. It's what's beneath, the sacrifice, the redemption." Her words echoed in the hollow chamber of my mind, mingling with the memories of every caller who had shared their fears, their hysteria, their stories of rising waters and creeping dread. Was this flood a punishment, a cleansing, or a message from beyond the veil? I could not say. The voices had become a chorus, a flood of sound that had drowned out reason and sanity alike. As the water crept higher, I felt the line between reality and nightmare blur. Hallucinations flickered at the edges of my vision. Faces of lost souls, the spectral outline of Mara reaching through the haze. I gripped the microphone tighter, trying to hold on to the thread of my own sanity even as the flood threatened to pull me under. The broadcast cut out suddenly, a harsh silence replacing the crackling static. The studio was submerged now, the water swallowing the last vestiges of my voice, my presence. In that moment, I understood that some floods do not just rise from the earth but from within. The tides of grief, despair, and the unquenchable need for meaning in the face of inexplicable loss. Days later, when the waters receded and the town began to stir from its stunned slumber, the community was irrevocably changed. Conversations turned to myths and omens, to mass hysteria and the supernatural. Some sought solace in the idea of sacrifice and redemption. Others rejected the notion outright, clinging instead to rational explanations. I walk these streets now, a stranger among familiar faces, carrying the weight of the broadcast that ended with the flood. The silence that remains is heavy, a presence as palpable as the rising waters once were. The signals may be lost, the voices faded, but their message lingers. An unanswered question, a haunting refrain that refuses to be silenced. And somewhere in the depths beneath the surface, I know Mara's voice still waits, urging us to listen beyond the static, beyond the flood, to the truths that lie beneath.